It's lovely to be here. But I'm in Scotland, in lovely Oban at the moment, and thanks very much to the South Georgia Association for inviting me to give this talk this evening. So let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen, and if I hopefully you can all see. Oh, let's see. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see the screen and then that's all shared okay.
That looks good, John. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Right, so my name's John Dickens and I have spent about 2.5 years on South Georgia. And I'll be talking to you a little bit about some of the work that we did last year at just around South Georgia, using drones to conduct all of these aerial surveys. But I first need to go back a few years. So I wouldn't be talking to you this evening if it wasn't for a TED talk that I watched in 2013. So TED Talks are short, educational, informational talks on a huge variety of subjects. There's thousands of these things. But this one that I watched was all about using drones for conservation and all of the different aspects that these tools would be used for in the future. So 7 years ago, they were still quite novel devices. They were quite expensive. Most of them were pretty large and they were quite unreliable. There's loads of videos online of drone pilots sprinting down the beach, chasing after their drone that's disappearing over the horizon. But thankfully, things have improved a lot since then. And we're now sitting with these drones that are much smaller than they used to be. There are still a lot of big drones out there, but a lot of them have become a lot more compact. The price of these things has dropped tremendously. And most importantly, they're also a lot more reliable. So this talk that I watched, it stuck in the back of my mind. And a few years later, I was introduced to the sub-Antarctic. And my first island that I went to was Marion Island, which is one of the Prince Edward Islands. So if any of you picked up a bit of an accent, if you guessed South Africa, 10 points. So I went to Marion primarily to grow a beard, but I also did a little bit of work with seals and killer whales as well. And it was on Marion Island that I met all of these amazing animals that would become such a big part of my life over the next few years. And this drone idea, this is where all of this drone work started to develop. And we did a huge amount of work with elephant seals. And we were working so close to these animals that there was quite a bit of disturbance to them. And there was also the safety aspect of the researchers themselves. One of the other guys who was working with me was bitten twice by elephant seals during that year. Neither bite was bad, but still, if we're working in such close proximity, there must be a better way to do it. The other side of things was looking at the efficiency and the environmental impact that we were having. So the birders would go out and work with the wandering albatross. Marion has a very big population of wanderers. And they would take hours going from nest to nest, checking to see if the birds were there. And while they tried to limit the amount of walking that they did to form paths in between these nests, it was inevitable that if you're going past these nests day after day, eventually you'd wear a pretty big path in. So if we could fly a drone up, fly it over, take some photographs to see if the birds are there, it could save a huge amount of time and it would save a lot of environmental impact as well. And the third side of things, which was quite a big one, was looking at the accuracy. So Marion has these huge colonies of macaroni penguins, hundreds of thousands. And watching some of the bird researchers go in and count a known area, count exactly how many birds are in that, and then just extrapolate. The best you can do is get a rough estimate of how many birds are there. And there were a few cliffs close to some of these colonies. And as soon as you got some height and you were looking down on them, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right here, everything just opens up quite a lot. And there's a lot more order that you can just start seeing individuals rather than just this mass of birds from a low oblique angle. So that all started developing in the back of my mind. And I had this project in my head. So I returned to South Africa and I was there for a few months, and then I decided, right, time to head back south again. And I spent 18 months on Bird Island, and it was my first time spending any time on South Georgia. And for those of you who know the islands, you'll know how rare a picture like this is up on that northwestern tip. Blue skies, sun. I think we had about 10 days like that over the course of the 18 months, but it was absolutely incredible. I was working with seals while I was there, and while it wasn't drone work, we were still elevated above the colonies. The researchers were safe from the seals. The seals were less disturbed to a point regarding the amount of work that we did on these animals than they would have been had we been walking through them day in and out. And once again, from that top-down view, all of these animals just became a lot clearer. Pups couldn't hide behind their mothers. The females couldn't hide behind the bulls. So you could just get a really nice, accurate view of what was going on the beach. For those of you not familiar with the Bird Island work, that's paint that we use to mark individuals so that we know who's who. So I returned for 6 months or so back to the real world, and it wasn't long before I finally managed to get another job. And this time I headed down to King Edward Point. But during my 6 months back in South Africa, I bought a little drone. So if my camera is still working, I went out and I bought a very small drone. It's tiny, but I racked up about 50 hours worth of flying time on that, taking videos of whales and dolphins and all sorts of things off the coast of South Africa. And when I started working at BAS again for the second time around, I proposed this idea of using drones for wildlife surveys. And there were a few people who were kind enough to listen to me drone on about these surveys that we could do. And I went for a few lessons, got my pilot's qualifications, and BAS supplied a drone, and down we went. So this is a view of King Edward Point and King Edward Cove that you would usually require a helicopter to see, or maybe if you were flying one of the Hercules from the Falkland Islands, you might be lucky enough to get a view like that. But this was taken with a little drone, a little bit bigger than my own personal one. So that's the drone that we took down. It's called it's a quadcopter type. It's got 4 arms, it's got 4 rotors. That's the camera unit at the bottom there. This is the remote control over here. And you just plug your cell phone in, you run the correct app, and off it goes. So it's a DJI, which is the company Mavic Pro 2. And it's an amazing little tool. That camera is stabilized, so you get this very, very stable footage from this drone. And it can fly at speeds of about 72 kilometers an hour, which is pretty fast for such a small little thing. And it can fly quite high and fly quite far, a few kilometers away. So an amazing little device, and small enough that you can just shove it in a backpack, which is incredible. So the main objective of going down and taking this drone with was to go and survey the elephant seals at St. Andrews Bay. So in October, during the last week of October, is the peak pupping date for the elephant seals. And we know that from previous records. And this is the time when the majority of females, the majority of cows are out on the beach to give birth and suckle their pups. And typically trying to conduct a ground count of that many seals, when you've got thousands of seals all in front of each other, on top of each other, it would be very, very difficult to conduct a ground count. And there would be a huge amount of disturbance. You've got enormous king penguin colonies up at the back. You've got all of these seals on the beach. So there would be disturbance. It would be dangerous for the researchers to try and find their way along the beach somehow to count all of these animals. And to get an accurate count from the ground would be just very, very difficult. So things look a little bit different once you are up in the air. And that's a picture from one of the drone images. You've got king penguins up at the back. So these are this brown patch up at the back there. Hopefully this is as clear on your monitors as it is on mine. Those are king penguin chicks. These are king penguin adults. And you've got all of these elephant seals on the front here. So just to give you an overview of how this is done, basically you just fly the drone up into the air and you fly along a set path, taking photographs every couple of seconds. So you set the camera so that it's pointing straight down, And the objective is to get enough overlap between images that you are taking so that software can then stitch these things together. So it's basically like any aerial survey that's been done in the past from planes or from helicopters, but we're just using a drone to go and do it. So you fly the drone at a set speed along the beach, and it takes multiple photos all the way along. And you end up with this area of images that you've captured. Now, if you've got a much bigger area, you can fly transects and just fly basically back and forth over this area, just ensuring that you've got enough overlap between images so that you can stitch them all together. The drone returns to its takeoff point and hopefully lands safely, well away from all of these animals. So the researcher or the pilot is nice and safe. The animals are undisturbed if the drone is flown at a reasonable height so that they can't hear it. And this is an example from the St. Andrews Bay survey. So hopefully this will play quite, it'll be a bit jerky, but these are all of the images that are taken one after the other. And it might not look it from this slideshow, but there's enough overlap between each of those images that we can then stitch them all together. And it forms basically one big panoramic image of the entire beach. So from this height, you can already start to make out there's some bulls, there's cows, there's pups. And what you end up with, once you've stitched all of those images together, is a full orthomosaic image, which looks a little bit like that. So from this height, you can't really get very much definition from this image. But if we zoom in a little bit, so that image is made up of about probably 150 photographs, individual stills. So we can zoom into that section, and you can see this is a big channel that flows out from the glaciers, which dissects the beach. And this would have been impossible for us to get across if we were conducting a ground survey. It would have been completely impossible for us to get to the second half of the beach unless we had a boat to get round. So if we zoom in a bit more, now you can really start to get a bit more detail and start making out the animals. But we can zoom in even more and get a higher resolution. And now you can clearly see all of the individual seals on that beach. We can zoom in even further to give you a clearer overview. So we can now go ahead and start counting every animal that's on that beach. I won't go through this process counting all 6,000 and something cows, but by using a different version of, or a different type of software, we can draw dots on every one of those animals and break it up into the different classes. So the nice thing with elephant seals is that the bulls are so much larger than the cows, and the pups are really distinguishable from the cows and everything else as well. So by doing that across that entire coastline manually takes quite a long time, but you get a very, very accurate idea of exactly how many animals are on that beach. In the future, it looks like there'll be software that'll be able to do this, artificial intelligence software that will automatically recognize the individual seals, and it should be able to distinguish between the males and females and pups as well. So that's the full count of St. Andrews Bay, which is the first time that that's been done in 24 years. We've got a full count of all of the cows, bulls, and pups. And we managed to do that on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th of October. So 4 full days of flying all the way along this beach. It took very little time to do these flights. It took much longer to do the counting on the computer, but it's a highly accurate count, and it's something that hasn't been done for this area before. And by doing flights on subsequent days, we worked out that the peak pupping date was about the 25th of October. There were far fewer females arriving between the 24th and 25th than there were between the 2 previous days. So it's an amazing opportunity to get to do this count. And we managed to do the same thing at Hound Bay on the way back to King Edward Point from St. Andrews Bay. The weather was just unbelievable. We had this weather window of about 4 days where we could go out and do the survey, and we had glassy, calm seas all the way over to St. Andrews and back again. So it was really, really lucky to have that weather window. Around King Edward Cove as well, I also managed to do a lot of flights. I conducted about 50 surveys over the course of the season. along this coastline and doing exactly the same thing, flying the drone along the coast, taking images, and then stitching all of those together. And if we zoom into this section, that red rectangle there, that's King Edward Point. We can zoom in further and you can see all of the elephant seals on the beach. So it's an amazing way to get a really accurate count of all of these animals. And we can do the same thing for fur seals. So this was my Vicken in December. And fur seals are great as well. The bulls are bigger than the cows, and the pups, these little black pups, are very, very distinguishable. So we can get a full count of exactly how many fur seals are along the coast. Thanks to the South Georgia government, we were also able, or I was also able to head down to look at these lovely beasts. So there's a small population of Weddell seals that pup in Larsen Harbor and Drygalski Fjord at the bottom of South Georgia. They're on a few other beaches there as well. So this is Larsen Harbor, and the Weddells are well known to pup on Bonner Beach and Laws Beach, which are the two beaches on either side of the bay. And there've been one or two records of seals on the back at the ice at the back of the bay. But using the drone, I could fly over, and it's the first records that we've got of cows with their pups, and even a hole in the ice, a breathing hole in the ice that we could record at the back of Larsen Harbor. So it opened up a completely new area that we just wouldn't have been able to look at before. And it's not limited to seals. We can do the same thing with gentoos. So these were gentoo penguins at Maiviken, and flown at a reasonable height, you can count every bird that's on its nest and get a really accurate count of how many birds are there without disturbing them by flying at a reasonable height. And we were also able to go to the Bay of Isles. So this is the Pharos, the Fisheries Patrol vessel. And the Bay of Isles is interesting because it's got it's got a fairly large population of wandering albatross that nest on these islands. And they surveyed fairly infrequently. Albatross Island is surveyed about once a year. Prion Island is surveyed about 3 or 4 times a year. But the other islands, we don't go to them very often. They are very isolated to get to. You have to have the ship to go in and then go ashore by rib, by one of the smaller vessel. And one of the biggest issues that we have is the potential of introducing invasive species. So as I'm sure lots of you are aware, there's been a huge amount of money put into getting rid of the rodents, getting rid of the reindeer. And I'm not suggesting that we would take reindeer onto these islands with us, but there would be a good chance of accidentally introducing plants, invasive plants. If there were seeds caught on any Velcro or anything, that would be a huge problem. So by flying over these islands using a drone, we can do a full aerial survey of all of them. I managed to do all of the islands that have historically had wandering albatross on them in the past over the course of about 4 hours in one morning, flying from the back of the Pharos. So the Pharos would go close to one of the islands, we'd launch the drone and fly back and forth, collecting loads and loads of images. And if the battery was getting low, I would fly back to the Pharos, we'd change the battery out and then fly back to the point that we left off on and carry on. So to be able to get full high detailed aerial maps of these islands over the course of a morning without having to have a helicopter sit down at South Georgia over the course of the season or fly a plane specially over to try and get this sort of footage, it's absolutely amazing. So we can zoom into Prion Island to get a bit of a closer look. So Prion has a boardwalk on it, and using the drone, you've got the potential to go and see if any work needs done on the boardwalk, if it needs repairs. So tourists go ashore here and they can go and see the wanderers from this boardwalk. There's a fur seal lying over there, which you might be able to see on your image. But the main reason for flying over for us was to go and look for wandering albatross. So here you can see this is a wandering albatross nest. They produce these sort of cup-shaped nests on the ground. It was quite late in the season, so the wandering albatross chicks had already started wandering around. They tend to stretch their legs and go for a bit of a walk when they're old enough. So that's a wandering albatross chick over there, and that's an adult over there. So looking down at this bottom section of the island, we can see the same sort of thing. So there's a nest and there's a chick. So it's a very beneficial tool to go and be able to survey all of these islands, get an estimate of or to get a count of the number of birds that are still on them. And we also had an amazing whale season. We had a huge number of humpback whales come down during the 2019 summer season, 2019-2020 season. And I particularly like this image because we've got Grytviken in the background where all of the whaling took place. We've got Discovery House over here where so much of the research took place that led onto the moratorium on whaling. And we've got humpbacks returning into the bay for, it's one of the first times they've been so close to King Edward Point since the whaling years. So I really like that image. It's just this nice circle of how everything's been going there. And undoubtedly one of my best sightings, I was over at Maiviken doing some research on the giant petrels. I looked out to sea and there was this massive spout, and I put the drone in the air and up surfaced a blue whale. And I think it's also one of the first times a blue has been seen so close to the island. Anybody who's been following the BBC News recently will have seen all of the news, Jen Jackson and the rest of the whaling team's news on blue whales on South Georgia. So I was just so happy to capture that footage because I don't think anybody would have believed me had I come back to base and said, oh, just saw a blue whale over at Maiviken. So that was some of the wildlife work that we were doing. And the drone work extends well beyond that. I mean, these were a few flights that I did around the whaling stations in Stromness. This was looking at a few of the whaling stations for the government. The builders were interested to see what sort of condition the whaling stations were in, and done in exactly the same way, flying back and forth across these big areas, covering as much land as possible, and capturing a few single images as well of the whaling station. So this is Husvik, looking rather run down. You can see the streams have been flowing through the station and some of these buildings have just collapsed completely. There's Stromness from a very different angle. And Grytviken, which is easy enough to fly around, being so close at King Edward Point. And I believe we'll be hearing a little bit about these here quite soon. So those are some of the whaling station bits and pieces. And I'd like to just finish off by showing a few short videos. This works best if I have some audio playing in the background. So hopefully this won't break any copyright infringements or anything, but here's a little bit of audio and some beautiful South Georgia videos to finish off the talk on. Is that working? Technical difficulties. Let's see if this works now. Don't think I'm going to win with sound.
Amazing.
Great, and I think that's it. We finish off on the St. Andrews Bay sunrise.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you very much for that. I think everyone found that very enjoyable. I did have some problems with my internet, and I got cut out for a little bit in the middle, but hopefully it was okay for everybody else. Are there any questions for John? I mean, there's lots of very positive comments coming up on the chat. Somebody even asked you to sing a song, John, to accompany the video, but Jerome asked that. Also, someone wanted just confirmation of the model of drone you were using.
So it was a DJI Mavic 2 Pro. I can go back to that slide just to show you it again.
And also a question about the height you were flying at to avoid disturbance, John. That was the other one.
Yeah. Right, let's go out of that. So I think we'll head back into that. Right, we'll start off with the model of drone. So it's a DJI Mavic 2 Pro, which looks a bit like that. So it's just a regular drone. You can buy them from most decent camera shops and just online. The learning curve is really easy. It's quite easy to learn how to fly them. And yeah, there's a lot of redundancy and a lot of backups in place to ensure that they are as safe as possible. So what I didn't mention was that they're fully connected to, they've got lots of GPS sensors and things inside them. So they're connected to loads of satellites. As you fly along, every single picture that's taken has this geo-reference point attached to it. So it knows exactly where all of these photos are taken. So when you are stitching everything together, that image is already geo-referenced. So you can then just drag that into a GIS program, and it automatically lines up with everything. So they're amazing little devices. And regarding the height that I was flying at, it depended on the surveys that I was doing. So something like that would be about 100 meters. There was absolutely no disturbance with the LEs. Well, I mean, if anybody spent any time on a beach that's covered in elephant seals, you'll know how loud it is. They make a huge noise, and you've got thousands of kings at the back as well, which are all making a noise. You've got the noise of the sea as well. So there's so much external noise that the sound of the drone is really drowned out. But for some of these lower aerial shots, for this complete stitch that I did, that was at about 60 meters, and that was high enough that we could get high enough resolution to see every individual animal on the beach. In the Bay of Isles, I had to fly a little bit higher. Some of the islands, particularly Albatross Island, it's about 80 meters above sea level. So I had to ensure that I was flying at a height suitable enough that I would have enough distance between the top of the island and the height of the drone. And there is software that you can use that follows the topography of the land. But all of these flights that I made here were all manually flown. And it would be very difficult to judge the height that you're flying at if you were doing that manually. The restriction in that airspace, you can get permission to fly above it, but we were restricted to about 120 meters. So most of the flights were between sort of 40 and 120 meters.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, John. There are a few more questions for you in the chat, but just for the benefit of time, I suggest we'll move on. If you could have a look in the chat and answer a few of the questions that have come through to you, John. Also some really positive feedback on your talk, which I'm sure you'll be happy to read and see anyway. And your tea towels falling down, but apart from that, all went very well. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, John. That was excellent. And I'm sure everybody really enjoyed seeing South Georgia from a different perspective and hearing about the different wildlife. Okay, well, next up we've got Rob Robinson. So we're going to hear a little bit about the Viola, or Diaz, which some of you will have spotted in John's presentation. So Rob, if you're ready and happy to share your screen and take over, the floor is yours.
I'm very much indeed ready to take over. That was excellent. Really enjoyed that. What I'm going to look at is going beyond Great Vic and beyond South Georgia in many respects, because I'm going to look at the story of the Viola and try to explain why it's so interesting and why it is such a unique vessel. I'm going to look at several different areas. I'm going to try to cover the background. Why do we have an interest in this particular ship? And then look a bit of its career and what it did throughout the 20th century. And then finally, you know, where are we trying to go with this vessel? What are we trying to do with it? So let's get stuck in, really. I'm a maritime historian. I work at the University of Hull, or I did. I'm now an honorary research fellow. I'm retired. And I really got quite an interest in the vessel from the late 1990s. We were embarking on a nationwide study of the English fisheries for Conway Maritime Press, and Conway like a lot of images, and they wanted something a bit unusual. I mentioned about the Viola, about the fact this vessel lay at South Georgia, that it was probably the oldest surviving steam trawler in the world, and I could probably get a couple of images of it. They asked me to write a piece upon it, and when I started writing up the stuff on the Viola, I realized just how important a ship we were dealing with, and how it was such an important segment of the UK and indeed the world maritime history. Not only that, when I started doing some work on the background to it, I dug out the early crew lists from the vessel's early days, and I noticed my great-grandfather had sailed on it as mate, which was incredibly surprising back in 1907. And that, of course, gives you quite an interest. So over a period of time, we put together the story of the ship, working with various people, interrogating early records in various sources, people actually who remembered this type of vessel working. We put together the story and published an article on it in the Mariner's Mirror. Not long after that, I was approached by several individuals with an interest in South Georgia. It would be about 2003, 2004 by then, who had concerns about the vessel. The problem was, of course, that like the other vessels down there, they'd been left since the whaling station had been abandoned in the 60s and had gradually deteriorated. And there'd been an attempt to clean out the bunkers on the vessels in about 2003, which had only been partly successful. The result of that was that a year later, it was decided to do some more substantive work on the vessel, which involved lifting them. And that was the issue, because once they were lifted, what were they going to do with them once they were refloated? And there were suggestions put forward that they might be taken out to sea and sunk. And this was a concern to certain people. It was certainly a concern to myself and one or two other people. And as a result of that, I got in touch with quite a lot of maritime historians across the world. And we all lobbied the government of South Georgia. To be fair, I think the idea of taking the vessel out and sinking it and the others was a bit of a secondary subject, but nevertheless, our work helped reinforce the fact that these vessels were particularly important, and none more so than the Viola. On the back of that, we began to look at the long-term issues to do with it. The Viola in 2004, as the Diaz, was refloated and again secured in the beach in the way that it is now. But in essence, that's a sort of medium time fix for the vessel. It will continue to deteriorate, as will the others, unless substantive work or something is done with them. And we gradually, with the help of people like Tony Ellerbeck, who's had a lot to do, of course, with the South Georgia Association, looked at the idea of bringing the vessel back. But it was going to be quite a difficult job, and I'll come back to that later on. But certainly this led us to examine and study the vessel and the people who work with the vessel in all its different contexts. And what we uncovered really was a story of the sort of a maritime history of the long Atlantic during the 20th century. And I'm going to just pick out some of the key elements of the Viola story from that. The vessel itself was built in 1906. It was constructed at Beverley. If you look on a map of the East Riding of Yorkshire, you'll see that Beverley's way inland. But in actual fact, it's situated on the River Hull and was one of the major places for building steam trawlers and their successors right through until the 1960s. This vessel was built there. It was built for a firm called the Hellier Steam Trawling Company, and it was going to be used for in what they call the North Sea boxing fleets. Charles Hellier, who ran the company, basically was a trawling tycoon, probably the first of his kind, and he'd envisaged the building of a fleet of 50 vessels to go out and fish in the North Sea, and that indeed is what he embarked upon and what he actually constructed. He was also a bit of a Shakespearean nut. Everything he had around him, he named after Shakespearean characters. Even his son was called Orlando, and he named all his vessels after different characters from Shakespeare. Hence, the Viola got its name. The vessel sailed on in early March 1906. It joined the first sailing of the North Sea boxing fleet, and incredibly, the fleet that sailed out into the North Sea in March 1906 remained at sea until August 1914. I might say that's totally impossible. Vessels can't stay out for that long. Well, they didn't. The fleet was always on the grounds, and as a couple of vessels sort of ran low on fuel and the crews needed relief, they would sail back to port, and other vessels would come out and replace them. As a result of that, there was a constant presence by the fleet on the grounds for that period of time. Their fish was packed in boxes and then transferred by open boat, winter or summer, to fast steam cutters, which ran it into Billingsgate in London to unload. These were called the North Sea boxing fleets. It was a particularly perilous job, and this was the role that my great-grandfather, by the way, had played at the time. The vessel continued in that role through until the Great War. It would probably have continued for a long time afterwards, but of course, in August 1914, the Great War was declared. The fleets were immediately called back from the North Sea, and within weeks, the Viola had a new job altogether. It had been recruited by the Admiralty. And of course, when we think about the Great War at sea, what we tend to think about is we tend to hear about dreadnoughts and Jutland and that sort of emphasis. But much of the day-to-day work off the coasts of Britain was actually fought by fishermen and fishing vessels. Indeed, if we were to drain the North Sea, if we were able to drain the North Sea and look at the shore, we would see a battleground that stretched all the way from not far from the coast of Flanders, not far from where the Western Front is on land, all the way up to Scotland, in what we call the East Coast War Channels. These were specially swept channels that vessels were allowed to sail up and down. And the job of the Viola and several vessels like it were to keep these channels clear. Some of the vessels were involved in minesweeping, others were engaged with the U-boats. And it was the U-boat dimension that the Viola was taken up into service for. She had a crew of fishermen. She was armed initially with just a 3-pounder gun and what was called an explosive sweep, which was towed behind the vessel. And if it came in contact with the U-boat, then it was expected to be exploded. It was very primitive and very simple. And it spent the first 2 years of its life, of its wartime life, patrolling from Lerwick and patrolling between Muckleflugger to the north of the Shetland, down as far as Fair Isle. It had 1 or 2 encounters with U-boats. The vessel, like the others that were working with it, were particularly equipped, able to do much with the U-boats at that time. While it was on those duties, and it did a lot of work there, 2 members of the crew, 2 of the fishermen who were attached to the vessel at different times, died. I'm not going to go into the story of why they died down, but basically they died as a result of being on military service. In 16. By that time, the vessel was armed with a 6-pounder gun, later a 12-pounder gun. The vessel and the immediate other flotilla of vessels that it worked with were transferred down to the Tyne, and their job was to patrol between the Scottish border and Whitby in North Yorkshire. And it was during that last 2 years of the war that the vessel encountered, or rather had many encounters with U-boats, armed encounters, which led to the exchange of shots in both directions. The skipper of the vessel on one occasion was mentioned in dispatches for driving off a U-boat which had been attacking a Norwegian merchant vessel. It was quite a period of time. Indeed, it's worth reflecting that our vessel had been built in 1906, and within a few weeks of the vessel having been built, by the way, HMS Dreadnought had been launched to much greater acclaim. And not long afterwards, the Germans had built their first U-boat, the U-1. If we move forward to the Great War, which vessel was involved in sinking the most enemy vessels? Well, it wasn't the U-1 and it wasn't the Dreadnought. It was actually the Viola. And the Viola, in its encounters, was involved in the sinking in the last year of the war of 2 U-boats. By that time, it had been fitted with hydrophones, which were a new device, electronic listening device, and it was also fitted with depth charges. The crew were quite a formidable fighting machine. And during the course of the war, by the way, it's worth reflecting that this vessel was at sea week after week, month after month throughout the war, and undoubtedly sailed far more miles in the sort of on the maritime front line than any of the dreadnoughts did. It was involved in the sinking, as I say, of the UB-30 in August 1918. One of the other vessels that it was involved with there was an armed yacht that also took on. That vessel later moved on to become become a Trinity House tender vessel after the war. But in the last sort of weeks or months of the war, it was also involved in the sinking of the UB-115. UB-115 was sunk not only by a couple of destroyers and several of these armed trawlers, but also with the aid of an airship, the R-29. It was the first occasion that an airship had been involved in the sinking of a U-boat. And it was a first that was to be repeated in a different way in the context of the Viola story later on. The war ended in 1918, of course. The vessel was demobilized in 1919. A few months later, or a little bit later, it was sold on to the Norwegians. It was used initially for trawling off the coast of Norway, but trawling was not a popular activity in Norway. And later, it was purchased by a company run by Niels Forsen Alonso, and it was converted to go whaling. It's unusual for a trawler to be made into a whale capture vessel because of the lack of speed, but it was used for hunting humpback whales off the coast of Africa. Did this for a few seasons. There wasn't much profit made, and in the mid-1920s it was laid up at Sandfjord in Norway, which had become its base. A couple of years later, or within a couple of years, it was purchased by company Argentina de Pesca. Pesca, of course, as it's well known, and it was sent to South Georgia, where, of course, it was used for catching elephant seals. As many people who are listening to this will know, elephant seal hunting was quite strongly regulated at that time by the Falkland Islands government. There were only certain periods of time during the season when elephant seals could be hunted. The island was divided into 4 quarters. Only 3 quarters could be hunted in any one year, and only the large adult males were taken. The vessel did this work right through from the late 1920s through, of course, to the 1960s. But because it wasn't involved for the full, if you like, let's call it South Georgia season, it got used for charter work. And it was involved in a whole range of expeditions, from the Cole Larsen expedition in the late 1920s, right through to the Bird Island expedition in the early 1960s. And my colleague Ian Hart reckons it was probably involved in some degree of southern exploration longer than any other particular vessel in its story. It was also employed to relieve the Argentinian weather station at Laurie Island on one occasion when the Argentinian Navy had been unable to get through. So the vessel had a long life down in that area. It retained its steam engines, its triple expansion steam engines, in the 1960s. These were 1950s. They were converted to burn oil. But other than that, and the shift in the position of the bridge on the vessel, the basic structure of the vessel remained the same. And of course, sealing continued until the Grytviken whaling station closed in the early 1960s, when the vessel itself was mothballed, maintained for a number of years by the one individual who remained down there, and in case the industry restarted, the sealing restarted. Of course, it never did. The vessel eventually, with the accompanying seal vessels around it, sank to the bottom at its moorings, and that would have probably been largely the end of the story, of course, had it not been for the Argentinian invasion. And of course, if we remember, the spark that lit the conflagration was, of course, the landing of the scrap metal merchants on at South Georgia. And of course, one of the early things they were due to cut up were these three vessels that lie at Grytviken. But of course, they ran up the Argentinian flag instead, and the rest is history. It's interesting to think that in the retaking of the island, which was fought to some degree in relatively close proximity to the Viola, we saw the disablement of the Argentinian submarine Santa Fe by helicopters. This was the first, of course, occasion that helicopters had been involved in disabling a submarine, another aerial first. It's interesting to reflect to the fact that the Viola itself had been involved in an early aerial first with an airship. The vessel, of course, remained for a long period of time where it was gradually deteriorating, but of course this led to the need eventually to do some work on the vessel, and that, of course, is where we became involved. And of course, as a result of those early inquiries about what we could do with the vessel, we gradually formulated a plan about recovering the vessel and bringing it back. Because, of course, the situation that exists down there is a medium-term situation. Yes, the vessel was stabilized. Yes, the tanks were cleaned out, but the deterioration will continue. And what we have here is a particularly incredibly rare artifact. It's one of only 4 surviving vessels, for example, from the Great War, and that's just one of its stories. And of course, this vessel actually saw probably more action than the other 3 combined. So it's quite a remarkable vessel from a whole host of contexts. Problem for us, of course, was, okay, yeah, we need to recover the vessel. What are the logistics for doing that? And if we did recover it, what permission, how would we get permission to acquire the vessel or to bring it, to remove it? And at the other end, what were we going to do with it? Well, I'm not going to go through the full story of that. You can look on our Viola Trust website. But in later years, we've recruited a formidable team of people to support our work and what we're trying to do with the Viola. And we've conducted technical surveys. We know it's possible or we're confident it's possible to raise the vessel and to remove it and return it. At the other end, in the city of Hull, which of course is where the vessel comes from, we have a place to place it. Hull's very much involved in a new maritime project called Yorkshire's Maritime City, which involves the use of 2 dry docks, one of which will house the Arctic Corsair, which is one of Hull's last sidewinder trawlers. And the other dock has been earmarked for the Viola. And the story of the Viola is quite dramatic, but it's about more than fishing, if you think about it. What having the Viola back in Britain will do is provide us with a vehicle by which we can tell all sorts of different maritime stories. And of course, not least the story of South Georgia and the South Atlantic. And that also has an important element in terms of Hull. Hull's been involved in all sorts of aspects of South Georgia and indeed polar history at both ends, you know, as I say, the polar history at both ends of the world. But if I just concentrate very briefly on South Georgia and the area, let's just think about a couple of aspects. South Georgia, of course, was discovered by the Resolution. Everybody knows that the Resolution was built in Whitby, but it was actually had been a Hull ship. It had been built for a man called William Hammond, who eventually sold it to the Admiralty, and of course it was used for Cook's Voyage. Let's move much later. The Royal Research Ship William Scoresby, which played such an important role, was built in the same shipyard as the Viola and used the same engines, for example. And of course, if we go to the Falklands War, then the port that supplied most vessels, civilian vessels, to the Falklands War was Hull. It was a long engagement, and that's been brought home to me very closely in our involvement with this vessel, because all sorts of people from across the city and wider afield have come forward to share their recollections of the vessel and where we could go with it and what we could do. And we want to use it to be able to tell a whole host of stories. We want to use it to tell the Ellie fisheries history quite clearly, but we also want to use it to tell the story of its role in the Great War, a forgotten role of an island nation, very much up against it. And finally, we want to be able to tell the story or use it as a vehicle to be able to illustrate and tell much more about the South Atlantic and South Georgia in particular. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of that. You can read much more about the story if you don't know it on our Viola website, which is available, quite easy to find. Without going through the URL, just go Google Viola trawler net and you'll come up with it. Or you can have a read of our book Viola, which tells something of this remarkable story. What I would just finish by saying is the Viola story is really quite unique. It's very much a story of the long Atlantic and the 20th century, and it encompasses a long period of time. But it's not just about the ship, it's about the people whose lives and livelihoods were tied up with that vessel in all sorts of different ways. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain a little bit about the ship today, and I hope you'll like our way forward. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. That was really interesting, and good to hear a little bit about a vessel that certainly I'm quite familiar with seeing in a not too good state in Grytviken. And yeah, it was fantastic. So are there any questions for Rob? Lots of positive feedback, Rob. I'm just trying to scroll through the see if there's any questions for you. But I think everyone can see a copy of the book over your right shoulder there. So
yeah. All there.
Exactly.
I would say it's worth a read, but it's written by myself and my colleague Ian Hart, and of course Ian was one of the original people involved with the museum at South Georgia at Grytviken, and I think you'll find a lot about South Georgia within the book itself.
I'm sure. I mean, I read the book a couple of years ago, but it's probably spurred me to have another look at it again, I think, in the next few days. So, well, thanks, Rob. I mean, I think there'll probably be some questions coming to you on the chat. So if you'd be, you have a look at the chat and keep an eye on that and answer any questions that come through there. We will move on to the next talk. Thank you very much, Rob. Okay, well, next this evening, coming to us from Stanley in the Falkland Islands, we've got Steve Brown from South Georgia Government. Steve's the Director of Operations with the Government of South Georgia and, of course, the South Sandwich Islands. And Steve is going to give us a bit of an update on what's been happening on South Georgia in recent times, and a little bit perhaps about the impacts of COVID as well. So, Steve, if you're happy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me and to present this evening. It's really interesting listening to those previous two talks. and mention two vessels that I'm going to obviously touch on in my talk as well, which is good. Yeah, I thought this evening I would actually talk a little bit about what has been going on in South Georgia, and a bit of, hopefully a bit of sort of positive stuff regarding COVID, really, because obviously it is a bit of a doom and gloom thing that has changed everybody's lives considerably, and has, you know, even touched us down here in the Falklands, where we've pretty much escaped it a lot compared to the rest of the world. But it obviously, operating on a small island in the middle of nowhere is difficult at the best of times and requires a fair bit of planning and to make things work. But then you add in lots of complications about getting things there because of not being able to get it from countries that are struggling with the COVID. It makes it even harder. So, but I think what we want to sort of share really is it's just a little bit of what we've gone through. And I think we're quite proud as a team, and for everyone that's sort of part of the team, so not just the government, all the people we work with closely, to make things actually happen, and we're still delivering and operating, and we haven't just come to a grinding halt, which I think is we're sort of very proud of that, as I say. So it is a little bit operationally, because that's sort of my background. So bear with me on that, but I hope you do find it interesting and some insight of where we are and what we're going to do. So I'm just going to try and share my screen now. And you have to forgive me. There we go. Right. Hang on a second.
Is that working for you, Steve?
Pardon? No, it's sorry, it's operator error. Hang on. Okay, let's just.
That looks promising.
Well, we're getting there slowly. Right. Okay. Hopefully this will all work okay from Falklands. We are a bit limited on our bandwidths, but everything has gone so well with hearing the rest of the talks this evening. So I thought I'd just start here at the start of winter, because this is really where sort of everything started happening, on having to make some different decisions and how we still operate. So we've obviously been mentioned in John's talk. This is the mighty Pharos. This is alongside the new wharf, which I believe you heard about at a previous talk. So Pharos is absolutely key in our operation, really, and I will mention it several times through the talk, so bear with me on that. But I just thought that's a nice shot of it to start with, to say, again, alongside the new wharf where we operate out of all the time. So on a slightly warmer day and a slightly older wharf, you've already seen a picture of Pharos, so I don't need to dwell on that. But this is Pharos, which is our vessel that supports everything that the government does in the maritime zone, bits of cargo work, bits of packs movement, and most importantly, patrolling of the MZ, the marine zone, maritime zone. So, but going back to the previous photo, the winter time. So the winter time starts our fishing season, and fishing season in South Georgia is our primary income. That's what pays for the Pharos. That's what allows us to do what we want to do. It generally brings in the bulk of the money for the government, which then tends to go into the ship to patrol the zone. But so you can imagine our concerns with COVID, with what's going to happen with fishing. Can we get fishing boats in the zone? So it really started with some strange procedures. Well, so the toothfish fishery starts in May, and we have 6 licensed vessels that fish every year. But getting these vessels to the zone this year was an amazing effort on everyone's part. So this is everyone from the operators to the government officers to the BAS team to the people in Stanley. And as you can imagine, we had to do everything in full COVID mode. So normally the vessels would go down to South Georgia. They would be licensed and inspected from the station there by the government officer. And then if all was good, they would go and carry on with their season. Obviously this year, it was difficult for the operators to get their vessels to South Georgia. It was difficult for them to get crew. It was difficult for them to potentially finish maintenance. So there was challenges left, right and centre. So we had issues with getting observers on board. So MRAG, who supply observers, had a real mission to get observers on board the vessels. And then how do we do biosecurity? How do we do dog checks for rodents? So all of these normal tasks suddenly became quite mammoth. We were very lucky that we were supported massively with the British Antarctic Medical Unit. So we have been constantly talking with them about COVID and how you deal with it and how we can make things work. So we managed to get on and inspect vessels in Stanley. Some of this meant that some vessels came and actually waited in the harbour for over a month until the fishing season opened. Just because they wanted to be clean, they wanted to be a healthy ship. Nobody wanted to go to South Georgia with anything on board. And then the vessels were then obviously worried about us going on board because we were as much a risk to them as they were to us. So again, the PPE that we were wearing was probably protecting the vessel's crew more than us because they were probably healthier because they'd been at sea. But anyway, we went through all of this. We carried out inspections here. We got the dog on board as normal. So the dog inspected vessels as they came through for rodents. So we basically made a decision that we didn't want to skimp on any of our normal measures. So we carried on. This is not from this season, this photo, but all lines and everything was just checked. It's just an illustration. It's basically resulted in ending up with fishing vessels in the zone. So after inspecting here in Stanley, vessels made their way down to South Georgia and started fishing. So this was good. We ticked all the boxes. We were happy we were operating as normal, despite the massive challenges that have been put in the way by COVID. So everyone was very, very pleased about this. We also then decided that we still wanted to do at-sea inspections. So once in South Georgia and operating from Pharos, we took government officer out and they carried out at-sea inspections while the vessels were fishing. Now, again, this was interesting, again, because the ships were not so keen on having someone from South Georgia necessarily on board because of just the risk and the worries of COVID. So lots of reassurance and lots of PPE. We carried out this as normal. So again, operating our fishery to the standards that we always aspire to and not cutting any corners, and operators working really hard to achieve this as well. So this has gone incredibly well. So it basically, we managed to get 5 out of the 6 vessels licensed and operating with all full observer coverage and full mitigation and biosecurity measures in place. So just no compromise. So that went really well. Following this, we then have had the krill fishery. So the krill fishery came to us a little earlier than they normally do in the season, and with a couple more vessels than they normally do, partly because they finished their quota on the Antarctic Peninsula, and partly because the ice this year was worse, so they were forced up from the South Orkneys. So we had a slightly longer krill fishery, but again, we went through exactly the same process with the krill boats as our toothfish vessels, with inspections, some here, some in South Georgia, and then boardings from Pharos. So again, no scrimping in any of the standards we expect. And also the good thing about them coming to us, apart from generating a little bit of income that we perhaps weren't expecting this season from extra krill vessels, is that obviously they're having to pay for a license and they are being inspected and they are having to have observers on board and slightly improved standards. So again, hopefully that then just raises the bar of something that they then do all the time. So a sort of added bonus for South Georgia pushing up, hopefully, standards in fisheries. So this went well, but it did mean we had 2 fleets operating at once. So we had a krill fleet and a toothfish fleet, which meant 2 government officers were working. One was working one fleet, one was working the other fleet, and they were in isolation from each other and in isolation from the bass team. This is again just being belt and braces precaution. So every time they went on board a vessel, they would come back to base and they would have to do 14 days before they could reintegrate with everyone else. So it's been quite a challenge for the guys on the ground to manage that, to support the vessels. Just a real team from across the board. So whether this is the planning from sort of our side, working with the medical unit on what we can do, but right down to the guys on the ground who've actually got to live in a small team. And there was only 13 people on station. So you start putting people in isolation, it can be a bit lonely. Luckily, government officers have partners, so they isolated together. So that's not so bad, but there were some considerable numbers of days where they were not socialising with the station, and of course the disruption of closing off sections of the station to keep the isolation going. So really this is just a sort of closing shot to that. It's a bit of a later slide of the bass team. This is with only from the other day, from Polar Pride Day, with the remaining winter team and 1 government officer. And then obviously just an overshot of the station and an overshot of Pharos, because again, everyone who works on South Georgia, it's just a bit of praise to them really for the support that they have given to the government and to the operation of the island. And talking about isolation on crews as well, for the Pharos crew, we had 1 crew member who we couldn't actually get home, and he actually did 10.5 months on the ship. So there is some quite crazy numbers at the moment of people going to extraordinary lengths, as I'm sure there is, worldwide, but these are obviously the ones that have affected us and we've had to deal with. And I just wanted to share, because I think it is a success story that we've operated and run our season, which is what we wanted to, which is keeps business going, it keeps the operators happy, and everyone's just worked really hard to where we are. So that's the fishing season. So then we moved on from the fishing season and we lose vessels. So as I mentioned, we had 5 toothfish vessels, 9 krill boats and some support vessels in the zone for sort of May, right the way through to the end of September. Then we would normally have a little gap, and then we would be thinking, tourist vessels will be coming, yachts, expedition ships, and they can number up to anything of like 100 vessels, 100 visits, maybe around 30 different vessels in and out of the season, right the way through to the back end of March. So this gives us a sort of eyes on the ground without almost paying for it. So we have the fishing fleet, which will open its eyes, report anything that isn't paying a license. So you've got good coverage around the zone. Then you go into cruise ship season and you've got a similar sort of vessels transiting. Suddenly, we've lost all of these and we are literally down to the Pharos, the James Clark Ross will pay a visit, and maybe HMS Forth will come down, and that's it, really. And at the moment, we're potentially going to have two cruise ships or sort of super yachts after Christmas, but not quite sure on that one yet. So suddenly we've got this whole maritime zone with nothing really, not as much eyes on the water as we would like, and because there is no substitute from having a vessel floating around for maritime surveillance, if in my eyes really, and deterrent. So luckily we have had more assistance from Mount Pleasant Airfield, from the military here with the A400. So we're getting more patrol flights, which again is an excellent way for reaching right out down to the South Sandwiches easily and to the edge of the 200-mile zone. We've also invested some more and some blue belt money into marine management organisations, satellite surveillance. So again, trying to use some remote surveillance to target anything that perhaps is suspicious where we can task Barros. And then, as I said, HMS Forth has just been down and she will go down again through the summer. So it is something that is we're sort of hopefully on the ball with, but it does suddenly expose quite a policed zone to suddenly being quite empty of vessels. But we will see. So anyway, but I think the message is again that we're trying to be proactive and we are hopefully doing our best. So as I said, fishing season has ended. Then we were sort of going into tourism world, and we had planned for a big opening of our new visitor guide movie for the IATO conference, in end of April, early May. Unfortunately, that was cancelled because of COVID. And also at that point, we hadn't got our narration from Sir David Attenborough because of COVID. But luckily, the filming was all done. That was all completed in January. And then we managed to get Sir David to complete the narration, and the film was launched in September. So again, something that hopefully went down, it seemed to go down very well. And although not necessarily the audience we totally aimed for, the start of a cruise ship season, a tourist season, I think it was something that was still very special in a time that's not so good. But what we did do before all this, and as soon as COVID, I'm not going to talk through any of these pictures, don't worry, and you don't need to read anything. It was just an indication of where we were. But as soon as we started learning about COVID and what was happening, we tried to work on how we could manage it on South Georgia. So not only with fishing and day-to-day operations of getting people backwards and forwards with Pharos, but how we would manage tourists, cruise ships, visiting vessels. So we put a lot of work into this and basically come up with a plan of how we could operate and remain basically open. And we've never actually closed. We have had to close something, so we had to make the decision mainly because we weren't going to get any vessels, that the museum would not be open this season and certain things like that, which just are sensible. But we did and are still basically open. So if you could get a vessel to South Georgia, you could still do your sites, mainly because most of our sites are only wildlife. So there is not the impact on any population. But so we worked through this quite extensively to try and remain open, and which we are still open. If anyone can eventually get to us, it's just getting people on a ship and them being guaranteed they're going to be okay. But we'll see where that one goes. But again, I think it's just trying to be ahead of the game. I think, and this is the message I think we've really been quite positive and wanting to do, to try and work through things to be ahead of the game where we can and be positive about the situation. This is just a bit of a comedy photo I put in, really, because this is obviously the Commissioner, Nigel Phillips, and my boss, Helen Hammercroft, the CEO. And this was at our stakeholder event in September. So as most of you are aware, we normally hold a stakeholder event once a year in London, or to update again on where we are, what the government's up to. And obviously this year, not possible. So using the latest high technology there, you can see, and very smart desks, we ran that from Stanley, again like this, by Zoom, which was probably one of our first sort of big forums by Zoom where we were wanting to talk to stakeholders. So this went really well, and obviously everyone is really used to this now, but and our technology hasn't improved. We still got that table. This has led on to sort of just a bit more of what we've been up to, what's going on at the moment. Probably the big piece of work which has been out to stakeholder consultation, and that's now just being worked through, is the strategy for the next 5 years. Helen is now working everyone's feedback. We've had some really good feedback on that, which is excellent. So that will be with everybody soon and in the public domain. We've also had amazing response. We want to increase the number of government officers. We are sort of fairly stretched on government officers. It does get busy. It's a bit boom and bust, but we need to increase the number. So we've just had our first interviews for that today after processing 456 applications. So it's been tremendously successful so far, and we've had some really good applications. So that's all really exciting, and hopefully that will conclude end of next week, interviews. What we're doing this season, again, we are still progressing where we can with what we can. So we are still having our invasive weed team go down, slightly smaller than normal. Unfortunately, Sally and Ken aren't going this season, but we do still have a team going down on the ground. The decision was made that this could be done safely and without any issues. And to not do it would set us back. And we coming to the end of our 5-year program, and we just don't want to lose any ground with any of the weeds. So so that's all good. They go down. They're actually in isolation here until next week, and then they will go down on Pharos. So then some of the things that have already been mentioned, we have got our small building team, heritage team on the ground now as well. They have started work on mainly, well, some stuff at KP, which is a bit more routine, but then they also some heritage stuff. We're going to do a lot of work on replace the cemetery fence at Grytviken this year. We're also going to do some work on Pine Island Boardwalk, which is starting to see better days. Again, good for us because it's a quiet season, so we can get on and hopefully get a lot done. We're also going to do some stuff on the main store in preparation for SGHT, taking that on as part of the museum complex. And then one other thing which is really exciting, we have also got, and it's in with Gilks at the moment. Gilks are our turbine suppliers. So I don't know if you're aware, obviously we use the original dam that the whaling station operated from for generating our power. So we're pretty much 80% hydroelectric all year, with really the only 20% being on diesel boilers when we're just sort of a bit low of water in the winter months in the lake. But we have done some studies again with Bass and the facilities engineer for KP on measuring water flows from Boar Valley, which is the other side of the Gull Lake, basically the back of the whaling station. As you look at that picture, that's where we get our fresh water from for the station, but they have come back and said there's enough supply to run a small turbine there. So that is really quite exciting, because that's probably going to pick up the power for Grytviken, which would mean we can then maybe reduce our diesel boiler use at KP even more and go green. So that's work in progress. That's going to progress, not to install this season, but it's just quite exciting on the greening the station a little bit more. The other two projects, we've obviously, Rob's mentioned a lot about the Viola, which we're involved with as well and trying to advise. We've got a marine engineer going down who's going to undertake a virtual survey. He goes in after Christmas, so that's quite exciting to see where that's going to go. And then below that was the announcement last week from SGHT of the new artistic commission, which is going to run over the next couple of years for the Flensing plan. And again, just something quite exciting that's sort of coming up. And again, I just had to put them in because, I don't know, stamps seem to be quite a big thing in South Georgia office. Everyone gets a feed into it. And it was a big year because it was Farewell to Clyde, who had been down for 10 years in the Falklands as the patrol vessel, been down a lot to South Georgia, and very much becomes part of every team's life, same as the Pharos does down there. And they switched out and HMS Forth has taken over. So I just wanted to include that. It was a nice one that was just convenient at the right time. So then moving on, we have also started looking at the A68. So this is something that everyone has heard of in the news. Again, quite exciting. Again, going to be working more with BAS. BAS are planning to deploy some gliders, and I'm sort of hoping that Pharos might be doing some recovery of them, just because it's brilliant to get Pharos involved in some of the science as well. But we went down to have a look at the A68 on a routine patrol a couple of weeks ago. The weather was absolutely awful, and we didn't get any good pictures, unfortunately, but we did get quite an interesting radar shot. That is obviously the edge of the A68 disappearing off the screen. It did get some sextant readings for actual heights on it when the fog cleared, which was about 30 meters. And since then, we've had an overflight from the A400 whilst patrolling the zone as well. And I'm hoping to get some photos of that tomorrow, which we're looking forward to obviously sharing with people who know much more about glaciers than we do, which obviously is BAS. So, but it's becoming part of our monitoring now. It was quite interesting though, because Pharos steamed through about 8 hours of brash ice and gradually getting bigger icebergs to get to the ice edge, and then we're, I think, quite relieved to get out of that before it got dark. But and lastly, just it's been a bit of a whirlwind, maybe a bit all over the place, but hopefully not too bad. I think just wanting to show that we are doing quite a lot, and hopefully it's all good, and trying to do as much as we can. But I mentioned the rodent detector dog. Now this is something that has really been successful and is totally key in our operations here in the Falklands for vessels. So again, this is Sammy's nose. He's our sniffer dog who's based here in the Falklands. And he would normally start to being quite busy now with all of the cruise ships coming through, but he's just keeping up to speed with his training with Pharos's visits every time. But he is going to be, there's a talk on him next Wednesday, which you can get the invite from our Twitter page or our Facebook page. And it's just a little bit about the program. What's really good about this is that the same company that provide the consultancy and the expertise and the knowledge to our team here on the ground are now also working with a dog team in the UK, which are working with BAS to check the BAS vessel as well. So a companion of Sammy thoroughly inspected JCR before she departed to head to KP. And again, that's brilliant for us because biosecurity is something we've not really flexed on with COVID and don't really want to, because it's key to looking after South Georgia. But JCR is sailing all the way from the UK straight to King Edward Point. So it's again really good to have the ship checked before she sails, and then you know you've got no issues when she comes alongside at KP. So do look out for that. Everyone does seem to like the dog, and that's it from me really. So I'd just like to say thank you very much. I hope that's been sort of interesting, a little bit different, but sort of a bit of an operational look at what's going on at the moment, and hopefully we'll continue to just improve, and things will come back to a bit more normality soon. But thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. That was yeah, really good insight into what's been happening in an interesting and eventful time down there. So I'm just having a look through the chat in case there are any questions for you. If people have got questions, please feel free to throw them in. I'm sure Steve will be happy to answer. I don't see anything coming through for you, Steve.
Oh, that's all right. Well, hopefully I've answered everyone's questions.
Oh, maybe so. What's the timetable for the strategy, Steve, and the sort of getting that finalised and implemented?
It is still having the comments incorporated at the moment, and then it's got to go to the FCDO, and then it will progress from there. So I don't actually know the final timeline. That's Helen's baby, really. So, but it's imminent. We've incorporated everybody's feedback, so which is good, and we've had some very good feedback, which is great. Oh, so the boss is here now.
No.
I've managed
Hello,
to find
Nigel.
a few minutes. I've got to disappear in about 15, but if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to try and take them.
Well, great to see you, Nigel. And there may well be one or two questions. We've had some fantastic talks from John Dickens on the drones and the surveys at South Georgia that he did last year. Rob's given an excellent talk about the Viola, and Steve's given us a fantastic update on South Georgia government. So it's all gone down very well. But I'm happy to. I'm just looking at the chat actually on the Zoom to see if anyone's popping up. A question actually just for Steve and from Pat about the solar heating that used to be at KEP, and are there any plans to reinstall?
Yeah, actually, that has actually raised its head just recently. We are actually going to have a pyrology survey as part of just seeing. We need to know the levels of sunlight basically again. So, and I think this would be more looking at the PV side of solar panels rather than sort of the evacuated tubes which were there before, which had issues with the ice and then getting way too hot in the summer. So again, it's part of the strategy, like I mentioned, hopefully the extra hydro for KEP, for Grytviken side. This is another avenue to explore, just with the technology of PV stuff becoming so much better. And again, that fits in working. That's working with BAS to fund that survey and their sort of renewables department. So again, yeah, I definitely think so. Anything we can do to reduce that tiny bit of diesel we still use for heating, the better. It's so much nicer at KP not having generators running at all. So yeah, I'm all for that. So definitely on the cards.
Right, well, there's a couple of questions. I will invite the questioners to talk to you directly. So the first question is from David Drury. David, are you there?
Yes, I am, and it's delightful to see you, Nigel. And I hope everything is going well. We've heard a great story from Steve about what the government's doing. Just a quick one. The Chancellor announced yesterday in his announcement on financing a cut in the FCDO budget, and I wondered whether any of that might actually affect the government of South Georgia.
So the spending review is still very, very wet paint in terms of the granularity of what it is, but the major part of the reduction to the FCDO is, in fact, as you'll be aware, in terms of the government's decision that it won't achieve 0.7% of GDP for aid, and as SGSSI is not overseas development aid ODA eligible, it won't directly affect us. So strictly speaking, in terms of the way we operate, as you know, South Georgia is self-financing, but we do benefit from a number of funds in terms of science projects, Blue Belt, CSSF, et al. I think at the moment that's looking reasonably solid. As I say, it's still wet paint and we need the extra granularity, but at the moment, given where we are and given our self-financing status and given how this year has gone, I don't, always dangerous saying this, at the moment we don't see danger on the horizon in terms of the budget.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Next question, I'll go across to Alison Neal. Alison, are you there?
Hello there, everyone. So my questions to both Nigel and Steve, I don't know who would prefer to respond. What role, if any, do you see drones playing in government's management in the future?
Hi, Alison. Yeah, we're definitely seeing them coming in more and more. Certainly John's work that he has done has just sort of reinforced that, certainly with our routine monitoring sites, say, in the Bay of Isles, so Prine Island, Albatross Island, and the other islands, which we don't normally count. So I think we're keen on anything that can be used, droned basically, to be less intrusive, certainly on the wildlife front. And you can get more data, more accurate data. So that is definitely good. It did actually, the drone off Pharos, we do have a drone on Pharos, which we used last year with a suspect vessel in the zone while the sea was too rough to board, and we actually flew around it and got some amazing footage of the vessel at the time, showing things, showing fishing gear. And once you start looking harder at the picture and then the follow-up after our government officer boarded the vessel, it definitely tells the tale of what was going on. So I can see definite use for patrolling if you encounter something and you can't get necessarily in the water or onto the ship. Definitely the wildlife, and certainly again, John showed the whaling station images. That's something we are keen, and again, we're very keen to see those because we want to monitor the whaling stations, and just flying a drone at the start of winter, end of winter is a really good tool just to keep a check on what's going on where with the stations really. So I think used properly and with a directed sort of task, otherwise you just end up with masses and masses of images and footage that is lovely, but it might not, it fills up servers. So, but yeah, I can see them being really useful as we move on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Thank you, Steve. Next question I have is from Jane Francis. Jane, are you there?
Yeah, Dame Jane, how are you?
Yep, a quick question. I know it's not peak tourist season yet, but I just wondered if you'd sort of anecdotally noticed any difference with the lack of tourists at the end of last season and the beginning of this season. Are the wildlife celebrating?
We haven't seen any parties yet. It is a little early to tell, really, Jane. I mean, it will be useful, obviously, with your teams moving around, what they observe. And I think we will be asking them, because part of the work that we've been doing in identifying which sites we can use to evolve our management to try and ensure that visitation is balanced and that the distribution and impacts are managed is something that we've been working on. So I think this season, like everything, you try to take the silver linings. This season, once we get to the end of it, will be a useful benchmark, and we will be asking teams as well as the government officers to try and form an assessment. So too early yet, but it's something we're definitely going to look at.
Oh, great.
Thanks, Nigel. Thank you, Jane. Gordon Liddell has a question. Gordon, are you there still?
Yeah, hi, Steve in particular. When we installed the hydro scheme originally, the intention was that it would reduce diesel costs in order to pay back in about 18 years. Has anybody monitored that, and do we know if it's being as successful as it was intended back then?
I read your question and I was like, I don't know the answer, but I am actually quite intrigued now, and I'd quite like to do that, especially as we're potentially going to get a quote eventually for a smaller plant maybe. So I think it's something we definitely need to look at. All I can say is that it is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. It took a little while to settle down, but the plant now that we have it's phenomenally, I can't say the word, incredibly reliable, and you just cannot wish for a sort of, I don't know, I think it's an ideal green technology that we're so lucky to have, and so lucky that the Norwegians thought of it and installed the dam in 1906, 9, top of my head.
I have to say, we've just had the Joint Ministerial Council today with all the OTs represented. And Zach Goldsmith, who's the Minister for the Environment and the Oceans, made a really powerful intervention about the need to try and find getting ourselves to net zero. And the foresight that led to that hydro capacity being put in was absolutely superb and has helped us so much as we move forward. So, I would only say thank you to those who went before. And I would say that about so many things, actually. I've been writing the forward to the strategy, and so much you realize we're building on the shoulders of giants. It's not just this team, it's the teams over the years that have taken us forward. And that's just one more example of the forward thinking that's gone into South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands that we seek to be good stakeholders of, and good, what's the word?
Custodians or
it's a Helen's coined stewards, to be good stewards of South Georgia. And I think it's a really good way of looking at it. It's building on the legacy that's been bequeathed to us by, in many cases, you, but all the others who've worked in the teams, not just in the government of South Georgia, but in the various entities, SGHT, and all the wonderful work that was done on rodent eradication. I could go on, I won't bore you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and thanks, Gordon, for the question. And yes, next there's a couple of questions actually about A68. First one is from Alan. Alan, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Hi, yes, if you can hear me. In what ways do you monitor the route of the A68, and where at present is the best guess to where it will end up? And if I can ask VB's question, because it's obviously linked, how is this affecting your work and your plans and your projects?
Yes, very good. Okay, so I was going to say, we have been enough again assisted by BAS in predicting its movement and monitoring its movement. BAS have put together some really good little footage from the Sentinel satellites of its progress as it's moved up from the Antarctic and twisted around. And here we go. Very good, Martin. And so this is, I think, the primary way it has been monitored so far, and certainly scientists in BAS, or much more than us. I'm afraid I'm an engineering background and not a scientist. And now it's in our zone, we're obviously a little bit more interested in it. There's all the predictions about where it might go. We know it's 200 meters, sort of draft of 200 meters from Faris's little visit. I think it's about 30 meters above sea level to the top of it. It has got some cracks on it. It will ground somewhere around South Georgia. I can't really answer where it will definitely go. My gut feeling from previous things would be it will go around the south of the island and probably break up. But again, that's an engineer's guess and not anything massively scientific. We will keep an eye on it, obviously, because in the past there has affected toothfish grounds where things have grounded. It also, again, operationally, if it breaks up and gives us big bergs hanging around South Georgia, big bergs are really good to hide ships behind. So again, that's my operational head thinking, that we'll be taking a lot more interest if we end up with lots of big bergs in case there's someone behind one who shouldn't be behind one. So again, we're going to be lucky enough to have, obviously, the Sentinel satellite. We'll keep monitoring it. We'll get experience and advice and science from BAS. As I mentioned, they were going to deploy some gliders and do some more work on it. And we'll have the MOD, the A400, we'll be able to get overflight and some aerial photographs of it as well. So we will obviously just keep an eye on it and see where it goes and take it from there. There's probably a lot more science that could be said, we need to do this and we need to do that, but I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive answer.
Okay, thank you very much. If you want to add anything to that, Jane Francis, if you're still, yes, you're still there.
No, it's a very good answer, Steve. We've just seen the latest picture. I think Jane Rummel could say, what was it, on Twitter or Instagram today? And the iceberg is still coming towards the shelf. I think it's about, my estimate was it was about 150 kilometers from the edge of the southwestern shelf, and it's just swinging backwards and forwards in the small gyres in the current. But it's still tracking towards South Georgia, and it doesn't look like it certainly hasn't broken up yet. So we're still, I mean, Ambassador just saying we still don't know exactly where it's going to go, because it could go off to the north or it could go off to the south. We'll just have to wait and see. Yeah, but it's still on track.
Thanks very much, Jane. And there's one more question from an interesting question from Bruce Mayer on the chat. I think for you, Steve.
Yes, I can see it. Just Bruce, want to read it out, or do you want me to read it out, Bruce? Okay, I can read it out. So Bruce has asked, is there a conflict? I think this is the one. Is there a conflict of interest between krill and fishing and the future conservation of wildlife on South Georgia and the surrounding seas? Again, maybe a little bit scientific for me, but I can honestly tell you what I know about our krill season this year, is that we have only fished 43% of the total available catch. And again, as the mitigation and conservation measures I sort of mentioned earlier about what we have put in place for the fleet, and then all the work that CFAS does, BAS does on the zone where we can fish, so that we don't affect the wildlife on shore, the penguins where they feed. I would say, again, this is layman's terms, but I think this is what I believe, that we are managing it so that it's okay, that it is sustainable, and it is getting better and better, and how we have a really good fishery for krill, and you know, working up to the absolute gold standard of our toothfish fishery. I don't know, so Nigel is...
Yeah, I just add a little more to that. I'm not sure how much Steve had said earlier about the fact that as a consequence of the 5-year review, we increased the standoff distances from the islands. And that was based on precautionary science advice. And I think, so far as we can tell, that is the most precautionary approach. Now, it's always you need more science, and there are plans, and had we had Mark Belcher here, he would talk to you more about the plans that we have to conduct more evidence gathering in the next year to help inform that picture. We're also working with Jane Rumble in FCDO, who's also our CAMLO commissioner, of course, to ensure that we can get the most informed picture to advance the approach. You will see in the strategy that one of the things that we are absolutely staying true to is the need to ensure that wildlife comes first, and that what we're undertaking is something that's consistent with a precautionary, sustainable approach. We won't move away from that. So if the science tells us to go in a different direction and become even more precautionary, we will, period.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Nigel. That was really, really helpful. I was going to offer to chip in, but I think you've done a very good job of covering that. We have a couple more questions if you have the time. One is from, I can't quite read that without getting too close, about blue whales and the recovery of blue whales. Are they mostly on the shelf edge? And maybe actually I can perhaps answer that question there.
Yeah, exactly. Go for it.
I was involved in the survey that's just been published, actually, of whales around South Georgia, where we saw large numbers of blue whales in January of this year. Seems a long time ago now. And we were actually surprised by seeing, and as you saw from John Dickens' footage as well, seeing blue whales quite close inshore, both on the south side of the island and to the north. Although I think the general thoughts are that they are more likely to be found on the shelf edge. And the survey we did, which was on a boat called the Braveheart, we were actually more focused on southern right whales, so we're working more inshore. So it didn't really get out to the shelf edge that much. So but we did see a lot of blue whales out there. So I hope that helps ask your question. There is a paper just published in Endangered Species Research, which deals with the recovery of blue whales. So I would point you in that direction. There's now a question from Peter Gilbert. Peter, do you want to ask this one yourself?
I'm very happy if you'd like me to. Nigel, it's Peter Gilbert from RCDS. How are you?
Yes. Hello, Peter.
Hi, good to see you. So as I've said there, it's a very selfish question. I'm due to be visiting visiting you in February 2022. Any gut feelings about how close to normal things might be by then? I know it's an impossible question, really.
Well, I think February 2022 is probably going to have a better chance of success than February 2021. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I'll be really candid about where we are at the moment. The cruise ship industry has effectively cancelled the Austral summer season. There are a couple of boats that are seeking to conduct operations. And one of the things I thought may happen, we have seen an example of, which is a vessel that's going to go to sea for a month. So as long as you've got clean crew and clean packs, then you should be safe as long as you maintain a hermetically sealed program. And that's exactly what their plan is. And they're going to take it in Antarctica, South Georgia, and then disembark from the Falkland Islands. That's the plan. There's an awful lot of protection measures that needed to be put around that. What the season being cancelled is going to do on top of the cancellation of the northern season is really hard to tell. You know, a lot of these vessels are expensive things to just keep going. And there are, you've probably read in the news as I have, there are vessels cruising up and down the Mediterranean just to keep their machinery working over and coming to Gibraltar to refuel. That said, all the operators are still talking to us about developing the programs. So I would say if one considers, you know, and this is all speculative, but if one considers the advances that are coming in rapid testing, the advances that are coming in vaccines, albeit they need to be proven, it doesn't sound unreasonable that there will be a season. What that will look like exactly and whether or not all the operators that were there last season will still be there this season, don't know. But I think there's a reasonable chance given the advances that have been made. The position of the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands is as long as you can come safely, you are welcome. And we've made that declaration at the outset to try and help as best we can. And we've worked with a couple of the operators to see if things were possible. One of the final points I'll make, of course, is the position of the Falkland Islands, because for a number of people, the Falkland Islands is an also really important part of their journey.
Yeah.
The Falkland Islands, understandably, are being very precautionary when it comes to visitation. And so we're going to need to see how that evolves. And there are a number of programs in place to try and keep the tourist industry in being within the islands so that when cruise ships come back, there's something to visit. And that's, you know, part of the challenge, but there's some really good work being done there. Our guess at the moment is there will be an Austral summer 21-22. We think there will be, but we don't know the scale.
Thanks very much. That's fantastic. That's sort of where I was imagining things were, but thanks very, very much for that, Nigel.
Well, I hope to see you when you come through.
Fingers crossed. You might see me before because I'm penned in for a Mount Pleasant tour in July next year as well, actually.
Oh, lucky you. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you.
I've got about 2 minutes, so I'm going to have to run. Are there any final questions for me, which I'm happy to try and answer, but I do have to run in about 5. I've pushed it. Are there any final questions for me? Otherwise, I'll leave you in the capable hands of Steve.
I think that's wrapped up all the questions, actually. Thank you, Nigel, and Steve as well. I think we're drawing to a close now anyway, and I think people are ordinarily would move on to the bar and have a beer and a chat, but sadly that's not quite possible. But anyway, thank you very much for your time and answering those questions, and thanks also to Rob and to John for excellent talks, and thank you all for joining this evening. And as David said earlier, for those of you who aren't already members of the South Georgia Association, please think about joining. So thanks everyone for your time this evening. Thanks to the speakers, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to hosting another event for you sometime in the future.
Thank you very much. Really good.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you all. Bye-bye.
And unmute. Thank you. No, I need to get out now.
There you go. Wave.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Let's go.